Hello, today we are learning about Concept 5. It's a small world and poetry. It's a small world and poetry. This is for ASL2 Mission 3A. Let's get started. Alright, Cornell notes for this lesson go on page 36R for the small world portion and 37R for the poetry portion. Discussion day for Small World is Monday, December 3rd. Discussion day for poetry is Monday, December 10th. Is that when members of the deaf community first meet, they often try to figure out what they have in common. You will encounter that. And it's not them trying to be nosy or all in your business. It is just a social norm in the deaf community that when they first meet people, especially those that know sign, they try to figure out what they have in common. It's actually a priority, honestly. So how do they do that? How do they find out what's in common? They do that by inquiring about their deaf schooling, also inquiring about deaf clubs, which deaf clubs you went to. In current day, deaf clubs are really not as popular as they have been in the past, mainly because the advent of technology where deaf people can congregate and meet and communicate with each other on a frequent basis despite distance. But before technology, the deaf clubs were the primary way that deaf people really communicated with each other. If you are an ASL student, deaf people want to know, well, who taught you ASL? What was your teacher's name? What school do you go to? Why did you learn ASL? That's a common question that you should get once you meet a deaf person and you start signing to them. So be prepared with your answers in ASL as well. Another way that deaf people use to find out what they have in common with each other is they refer to common experiences. Were you mainstream like me, or were you state schooled like me? Mainstream is when a deaf child is placed in a predominantly hearing school and then goes to classes with mostly hearing students. A state school is typically a residential school where the students stay at that school 5 days out of 7 days of the week. Prior to mainstreaming becoming so popular, the strong majority of deaf children in the state were educated at state school, FSDB, and they stayed there 5 out of 7 days a week unless their family lived locally. Another common experience that is with state schools is house parents, because house parents play significant roles in deaf children's lives. They are also called house parents or dorm counselors, because while deaf children are away at the state school, they live in dorms 5 out of 7 days of the week, and their adult representative is the house parent that was assigned to that dorm. That house parent provides parenting responsibilities for that time at the state school, which is 5 out of the 7 days of the week. But they're also significant not only because they're parenting responsibilities, but also because they're excellent role models for deaf children. 90% of deaf children come from hearing families, so many of them are not exposed to adult deaf people. The students' morals and values primarily come from the house parents. Another way is another experience that deaf people meet to relate about is whether they came from a hearing family or a deaf family. If the deaf people are born deaf or born hearing. Shared interest or knowledge is another way to find out what they have in common. For example, what kind of work do you do? Typically, especially in the past, deaf people were only able to work only allowed to work in a few environments. All right, on to ASL poetry, and you can start writing these notes on page 37R. I put this under small world because deaf people, as you remember from ASL's stories, handshake stories, similar like that, really like to get together and share their talents. And ASL poetry is a talent that is native to them, natural to them. But in the 1960s and 1970s, ASL became recognized as a true language. So that is when ASL poetry flourished. Famous poets in the deaf community are Clayton Valley, who has since passed, Patrick Graybill, who has since passed, and contemporary Peter Cook. You might remember him as a dark-haired ponytail man talking about a dragon on the school bus. Consistent themes and signed performances of ASL poetry have rhyming. For example, cat and bat would be used in a poem because that's easy to see that they have the same sound and alliteration. Alliteration, which is actually using the beginning of the consonants of the words. ASL does that by using the compound signs, using the same signs to start off. And you'll see examples of that in your in-class assignments, such as sign mark. Visual patterns, because ASL is a visual language, you're going to see a lot of visual movement, visual rhythm, visual repetition, patterns using the visuals. Whereas if an English poem, you wouldn't see that. How does ASL poetry rhyme? Some quick tidbits about ASL poetry. It is extremely difficult to translate original ASL poetry into English. It's because it exists in performance, not on paper. There are many things that you can sign and describe and show visually that is really hard or really lengthy to write down on paper. All right, that concludes our lessons on Small World and poetry.